All right, so I think a lot of our listeners have probably wondered about this. Can devout Catholics practice yoga?
Mm-hmm.
Is it okay to, embrace those downward dogs and sun salutations?
Right.
Or is there something more to be concerned about, maybe like spiritually speaking?
Yeah.
We've got a stack of interesting sources here to kind of unpack this. We've got official church documents, articles from some Catholic publications, and we've even got some blog posts from priests and everyday Catholics.
Oh, wow.
So pretty interesting stuff.
Yeah, it's interesting because the Catholic Church doesn't have an outright ban on yoga.
Okay.
You won't find it on any official list of forbidden practices.
Oh.
But there's definitely this sense of caution that's kind of woven throughout church teachings.
Okay, so where does the church actually weigh in on this?
Mm-hmm.
What should Catholics be aware of?
Well, a good place to start, I think, is this 1989 document, Letter on Certain Aspects of Christian Meditation.
Okay.
And while it doesn't explicitly mention yoga, it does address Eastern meditation techniques. And the church's concern really lies in what happens when these practices are
detached
from Christian prayer.
So it's not necessarily the physical postures themselves that are the problem.
Right.
It's that potential for spiritual mixing.
Exactly. The church uses this term syncretism to describe the blending of different religious beliefs.
Okay.
Which can sometimes, dilute or even contradict your own faith.
Mm-hmm.
So the church strongly emphasizes, keeping that Christian focus front and center.
That makes sense. Now, some Catholics have expressed some pretty strong concerns about yoga.
Yeah.
Even going as far as to call it satanic.
Mm-hmm.
Is that a common view within the church?
I mean, while the church doesn't officially label yoga as satanic,
okay,
there are definitely individuals within the church who hold that view. Father Gabriel Amorth, a renowned exorcist, actually.
Wow.
He cautioned against yoga, stating that it could lead to evil.
Oh, wow.
And it's important to remember that, this is his personal opinion, not official church doctrine. But his perspective does carry weight because of, his position.
Right. So it sounds like there's this real tension here.
Mm-hmm.
On the one hand, you've got figures like Father Amorth expressing these grave concerns.
Yeah.
And then on the other hand, you have people like Flora Watkins, who wrote in the Catholic Herald about how yoga has been so beneficial for her,
right,
for physical and mental well-being.
Yeah, that tension is at the heart of this whole discussion.
Yeah.
A lot of people have really positive experiences with yoga, but the church encourages discernment. Even Pope Francis, while acknowledging the benefits of exercise, has emphasized that practices like yoga don't, inherently open one's heart to God. They aren't a guaranteed path to holiness.
So is the church saying that Catholics can do yoga, but only for the physical benefits?
All right.
And completely separate it from the spiritual aspect?
That's where it gets really complicated.
Yeah.
It's really challenging to draw a definitive line between the physical and spiritual. And something like yoga, because, a lot of the postures have names and meanings that are tied to Hindu spirituality.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a question of whether it's truly possible to compartmentalize.
Yeah, I imagine the setting plays a role too.
Right.
Like doing yoga in a class with chanting might feel very different from just stretching at home by yourself.
Yeah.
Does the church have any specific recommendations for navigating this?
Well, in his blog post, Reverend Gareth Lashon, he advises caution, particularly regarding that potential for spiritual influence, especially in settings where others may not share those same Christian intentions.
Right.
He highlights, the risks of oppression, or inadvertently endorsing beliefs that contradict our faith.
He also brought up a point that I thought was really interesting, the idea of scandal.
Mm-hmm.
Even if we as Catholics have pure intentions,
right,
engaging in a practice that's so closely tied to another religion could send a confusing message to other people and potentially lead them to believe that it's acceptable for Catholics.
Yeah, that's a crucial consideration. It's not just about our personal experience,
right,
but it's also about how our actions might impact or maybe even mislead others.
Right, especially within a community of faith.
Yeah, exactly.
So it seems like what we're seeing is that while the church doesn't explicitly forbid yoga, there are some valid concerns about its spiritual roots.
Yeah.
And, and the potential for conflict with some of those Catholic beliefs.
Right.
So where does this leave devout Catholics who are looking for ways to improve their, physical and mental well-being? What kind of guidance does the church offer for those people?
Well, one approach that the church encourages is what they call critical assimilation, which we'll explore in more detail in the next part of our deep dive. But this involves examining practices and beliefs from other traditions, not to blindly adopt them, but to really identify what is true and good while rejecting anything that's incompatible with our faith.
That sounds like a really important concept to kind of unpack. Yeah. Before we move on to that, though, I kind of want to touch on this historical connection between ancient Hindu spirituality and modern postural yoga, because some argue that it's actually a Western invention.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. And it was raised by Joseph Shaw, who's the chairman of the Latin Mass Society. And it challenges the assumption that, all yoga is inherently linked to Hinduism.
But even if the physical practice itself has evolved over time, the name yoga still carries those connotations.
Right.
So I wonder if that might be a stumbling block for some Catholics.
It definitely adds another layer of complexity to the discussion.
It seems like there's a lot to consider here.
Yeah.
We've got, personal testimonies about the benefits of yoga. We've got warnings from respected figures about potential spiritual dangers.
Right.
And then we've got this call for careful discernment from the church.
Yeah, what's a good Catholic to do, right?
Exactly. So what's a good Catholic to do?
That's the question we're going to continue to explore in the next part of our deep dive. We'll delve into the church's approach to critical assimilation, and we'll examine some alternative practices that might offer similar benefits, but without that spiritual baggage.
Okay, sounds good.
So stay tuned.
All right, we'll be right back. Welcome back to our deep dive into yoga and Catholicism.
We've been navigating some complex territory here, haven't we?
Yeah, it really is complex.
It's fascinating how, a practice like yoga, which seems so simple on the surface, can raise these really profound questions about faith, spirituality, and personal discernment.
Absolutely. And we've heard from so many of you, our listeners, who are wrestling with this very dilemma.
Yeah, it's clear that a lot of devout Catholics are looking for guidance on how to approach yoga in a way that, aligns with their faith.
Right. So let's delve a little bit deeper into that guidance.
Okay.
You mentioned this concept of critical assimilation earlier.
Right.
Can you maybe unpack that a little bit?
Sure.
What does that mean for Catholics who are trying to make sense of practices like yoga?
Absolutely. Critical assimilation, as highlighted in Joy in Truth, encourages us to kind of approach practices and beliefs from other traditions with a discerning eye.
Okay.
It's not about rejecting everything outright, but it's about carefully examining these practices through the lens of our Catholic faith.
So it's not about building walls and isolating ourselves from the world?
Not at all.
Okay.
It's about engaging with the world, thoughtfully and intentionally, recognizing that there may be elements of truth and goodness in other traditions, but always filtering them through the teachings of Christ and his church.
So finding those nuggets of truth, but staying rooted in our own faith.
Exactly.
Okay, so how do we actually apply this principle of critical assimilation to something like yoga?
Well, it starts with education, learning about the origins and the meanings behind the yoga postures, the chants, the underlying philosophy, and then comparing that knowledge to what we believe as Catholics.
So doing our homework, essentially.
Exactly.
Not just jumping into a yoga class without really understanding what we're getting into.
Precisely. And that's where those official church documents can be so valuable. Documents like the letter on certain aspects of Christian meditation and Jesus Christ, the bearer of the water of life. These offer us some guidance on how to navigate these complex issues.
They remind us that our spiritual practices should ultimately lead us closer to Christ.
Yes, they emphasize that the fullness of truth and grace is found in Jesus Christ. So we shouldn't allow ourselves to be distracted by, spiritual detours or practices that could lead us away from him.
So for those of us who are seeking that physical and mental well-being, but we want to remain, firmly grounded in our Catholic faith, what are some alternatives to yoga? Are there practices that align with these principles of critical assimilation?
Yeah, there are several options to consider. Reverend Lation, for instance, he's a strong advocate for Pilates. He sees it as a way to achieve similar physical benefits to yoga, but without the potential spiritual conflicts.
I've heard Pilates is excellent for strengthening and toning the body.
Yeah.
And it seems to be, more focused on those physical aspects.
Right.
Without that emphasis on the meditation and Eastern spirituality.
Exactly. And there are also many exercise programs that are designed to incorporate the physical benefits of yoga.
Okay.
But without the spiritual components. You can even find modified yoga classes that focus on Christian prayer and meditation.
I think some Catholic organizations even offer those types of classes.
Yeah.
So it's a way to experience, the physical aspects of yoga, but in a safe and faith-filled environment.
Exactly. And it demonstrates that we don't have to reject something entirely just because it originated in another religion.
Right.
We can take what is good and true and adapt it to our own faith, always keeping Christ at the center.
In Flora Watkins' article for the Catholic Herald, she mentioned that some priests she knows had advised against yoga altogether.
Yeah.
So it seems like there's a spectrum of opinions, even within the church.
That's true. There isn't necessarily a one-size-fits-all answer.
Right.
That's why those open and honest conversations with our spiritual advisors are so crucial.
They can help us discern, what's right for our individual circumstances.
Precisely. And it's okay to have different perspectives within the church, as long as we engage in those conversations with respect and a genuine desire to understand each other.
So for those who are still feeling unsure about yoga, what would you say is the key takeaway? What guidance can we offer them?
I think the most important thing to remember is that you're not alone.
Okay.
In your questions and concerns. The church provides us with guidance, but it also encourages us to use our God-given reason and discernment.
Talk to your priest.
Pray about it.
Trust that the Holy Spirit will guide you to the right decision.
That's the beauty of our faith. It calls us to be active participants in our journey.
Right.
Constantly learning, growing, seeking truth.
And sometimes that means wrestling with these tough questions.
Absolutely. And even if you ultimately decide that yoga isn't right for you, there are countless other ways to nurture your physical, mental, and spiritual well-being.
That's a great point. Taking care of our bodies is an important part of honoring the gift of life that God has given us.
It is.
Speaking of honoring God, we often hear about the dangers of certain practices or beliefs.
Right.
What about the potential for spiritual harm in something like yoga?
I mean, that's a valid concern and one that we should approach with discernment, but also a healthy dose of caution.
Okay.
The church reminds us that while there may be elements of truth and goodness in other traditions, we have to be vigilant in guarding against anything that could lead us away from Christ.
So it's about recognizing that there are spiritual realities at play.
Yes.
Not just, physical postures and breathing exercises.
Exactly. And this is where that concept of spiritual warfare becomes really relevant.
Okay.
As Christians, we believe that there is a battle being waged for our souls.
Right.
There are forces of darkness out there that seek to deceive us and lead us astray.
That's a concept that can be tough to grasp in our modern world.
Yeah, but it's a fundamental truth of our faith.
Right.
And it's why the church cautions us against opening ourselves up to practices that could potentially invite negative spiritual influences into our lives.
So how do we discern the difference between a practice that is simply different from our own tradition and one that might pose a genuine spiritual threat?
It comes back to that principle of critical assimilation.
Right.
We need to examine the underlying beliefs and intentions behind the practice. Does it align with the teachings of Christ?
Right.
Does it promote love, truth, goodness? Or does it contradict our faith and potentially lead us down a path that could harm our souls?
It sounds like a lot of this comes down to intuition.
Yeah.
And listening to that inner voice that the Holy Spirit gives us.
Right. The Holy Spirit is our guide and protector. If something feels off or unsettling, if it creates a sense of unease or distance from God, that's a red flag that we should pay attention to.
It's about trusting our instincts and not being afraid to ask those tough questions.
Absolutely. And seeking guidance from trusted spiritual advisors.
Right.
Our priests can be invaluable resources in helping us discern what is truly good and wholesome for our souls.
So it's not about living in fear, but it's about approaching these matters with wisdom and prudence.
Exactly. We're called to be in the world, but not of the world, as Jesus taught. And that requires us to be discerning and to really guard our hearts and minds against anything that could compromise our faith.
I think that's such an important reminder for all of us as we navigate the complexities of modern life. There's so much to explore and learn from. But we always have to do so with that spirit of discernment.
Right.
And a deep love for our faith.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And with that in mind, let's move on to explore some of the specific concerns that the church has raised about yoga and the potential spiritual pitfalls that Catholics should be aware of.
Okay, let's do that in our next segment. We'll delve deeper into the church's teachings.
Okay.
And we'll examine some specific examples of how certain yoga practices might conflict with those Catholic beliefs. So stay with us. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We've been exploring this whole question of whether devout Catholics can or should practice yoga. And, as we've seen, it's a topic filled with a lot of nuances and complexities.
It is fascinating, isn't it? Something that seems so straightforward,
Right?
Like stretching and breathing exercises can spark these profound discussions about faith, spirituality, and the importance of discernment.
It really does, and it highlights these challenges that we face as faithful Catholics.
Right.
And in navigating our modern world, we're constantly encountering all these practices and beliefs from other traditions. And it's tough to figure out how to approach them sometimes.
It really is.
The church does provide some guidance, though, right?
Yes.
Through documents like that. Letter on certain aspects of Christian meditation and Jesus Christ, the bearer of the water of life, reminding us to really examine everything through the lens of our faith.
Exactly.
And we talked about this idea of critical assimilation.
Yes.
Taking the time to really understand a practice, its origins and its potential implications before we decide, if it's compatible with our Catholic beliefs.
It's so crucial.
It's not about shutting ourselves off from the world or rejecting everything that's different, but it's about, approaching things with a discerning heart and mind.
Absolutely.
And we've also heard from some of our listeners.
Who've shared their own personal experiences with yoga, some positive, some concerning.
And
I think that really just underscores how important it is to listen to our own, inner compass.
It really does. The Holy Spirit speaks to us in those subtle ways.
And
it's so important to, pay attention to those inner nudges, those feelings of peace or unease when we're considering whether to embrace something like yoga.
So let's delve into some of those specific concerns that the church has raised about yoga.
Okay.
And, the potential conflicts with Catholic beliefs.
Right.
One of the key concerns is this risk of syncretism.
Right.
Which we touched on earlier, that blending of different religious beliefs in a way that could dilute or even contradict our own faith.
Exactly. And we talked about how those yoga postures are often linked to, Hindu deities and spiritual concepts.
Right.
So it makes it really challenging to completely separate the physical practice from its spiritual roots. And the church encourages us to be cautious about those practices that could blur the lines.
Yes.
And potentially, lead us away from the centrality of Christ in our lives.
Exactly.
Another concern is, this potential for encountering spiritual influences. That might not be, aligned with our faith.
Right. As Christians, we believe in the reality of spiritual warfare, that there are forces of darkness that seek to deceive us and lead us astray.
Right.
And the church cautions us against opening ourselves up to practices that could potentially invite, those negative spiritual influences.
It's a sobering thought.
It is.
It reminds us that discernment isn't just about intellectual analysis.
Right.
It's about spiritual awareness and protection.
Absolutely. We need to be attentive to that spiritual atmosphere surrounding a practice and be mindful of the potential risks involved.
So what would you say to a devout Catholic who is drawn to the physical and mental benefits of yoga,
right,
but who's also deeply concerned about, these potential spiritual conflicts?
I would encourage them to, engage in a process of prayerful discernment, seeking guidance from the Holy Spirit and from trusted spiritual advisors like their priest.
So really it's about weighing the potential benefits against those potential risks.
Yes.
And making a decision that aligns with their conscience and their desire to live a life of faith.
Absolutely. And, it's important to remember that there are so many other ways to cultivate physical and mental well-being that are completely compatible with our Catholic faith.
Right. We talked about Pilates, those modified yoga classes, other exercise programs that offer similar benefits.
Right.
But without that spiritual baggage.
Exactly. And, beyond the physical, there's a wealth of spiritual practices within our Catholic tradition prayer, meditation, spiritual reading, the sacraments.
Right.
All of these things nourish our souls and draw us closer to Christ.
These are practices that have stood the test of time.
Yes.
And they've helped countless saints grow in holiness. So if you're feeling drawn to yoga, but you're also hesitant,
right,
I really encourage you to explore some of those other options. You might just discover a path that brings you even greater peace, joy, and fulfillment.
You might.
At the end of the day, it's about, seeking what is truly good and life-giving for our bodies and souls.
Absolutely.
And remembering that our ultimate goal is union with Christ.
Yes.
And everything else should be evaluated, in light of that ultimate destination.
That's a great point.
Well, thank you so much for guiding us through this really complex and important discussion.
Oh, it's been my pleasure.
I think we've all gained a much deeper understanding of the nuances involved and the importance of approaching these matters with discernment and, love for our faith.
It's been great.
And for all of you listening out there,
yes,
keep exploring, keep asking those questions, and keep seeking truth.
Absolutely. And may God bless you on your journey.
Until next time on The Deep Dive.